This is Duke University.
The coolest proxy for exploring national identity for me was this television program, Greatest Fill in the Blank, Greatest Frenchman, Greatest Briton, Greatest American, Greatest...
They didn't have a Canadian version, did they?
They had a Canadian
version.
version.
Oh, really?
They had a Canadian version. The Brits chose Winston Churchill. Don't you know?
Right.
The French told... This is true.
Yeah.
The French told...
I knew Churchill, but I don't...
Monsieur de Gaulle.
Oh, yeah.
Nous ici, nous-mêmes, on a choisi Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
Et puis au Canada, Tommy Douglas.
Oh, great, because of health care.
I would have to assume.
Must be.
Of course, it was a near...
See, Obama should be talking about Tommy Douglas.
It was a near-run thing with a hockey coach. I think...
Don Cherry.
Don Cherry finished
Yeah,
in the
of course,
top 5.
because he kind of has wild coats and... Yeah, that's right. Well, the sports historians would have been, you know, torn on that one, do you think? Or, yeah, but what do you think that says about...
I think that people, if anything, Canada is probably articulating a distinct Canadian identity in a way that it hasn't before, which could be a good thing or a bad thing. Clearly, Canada is still multicultural in the sense of the 1969.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, the multiculturalism act. But I mean, I've lived in the United States now. I'm an expatriate Canadian, and I've lived here for.
Huh?
Sorry. It's not well accepted in Canada. If you're an expat and you don't say nice things, if you don't say nice things. I met John first. I taught at the University of Alberta for 3 semesters, fall semesters in the 1990s. And I can remember teaching a class. It's a class I teach here. It's a comparative transnational history of the Canadian and United States Wests. And I suggested to the class that I thought Canada had gone a little overboard on controlling firearms. And the class went nuts. They said that I'd been assimilated, that I want people running loose in the streets with anti-tank guns. And I said, well, no, I just didn't think that Grandpa should have to bring every converted World War II Lee Enfield down and pay, what is it, $200 or something to register it.
Yeah, yeah.
But, I mean, it was real clear that these young people, even in Alberta, which is supposed to
Which
be...
is the most conservative, the Texas of the North.
Supposedly the Texas of the North.
Yeah.
So I've been to the real Texas, I got to tell you.
I know. It's more like Massachusetts before the last election, right? Yeah. No, it's absolutely true, John. And people ask me, am I an American? Because I travel to the United States and I spend a lot of time elsewhere. And, you know, I took that scholarship, which most people wouldn't have done if Oxford had offered them a full scholarship. And the people who don't have to make those choices, they think, oh, well, you know, it's... And, you know, I remember conversations from many years ago, and I remember one that John and I had and someone else was present. He said, you know, Duke sports, but when I was at McGill, there were more problems.
Yeah.
Right? And they couldn't believe that. They wouldn't believe it. And the other thing, too, is Canada has more, except in war zones, more firearms than any other country, I think, in the world but the United States. But that's not part of the Canadian myth, you know? And so I agree with you that what I like about all this stuff is trying to shake things up. And it's interesting to teach a similar course in Europe, United States, and in Canada. And I think that Canadians, the doctors and others, didn't want health care in the early 60s. But now it's like, you know, they won't even do what Britain does, where you can pay for a private operation. In Canada, that's like, you know, bringing in anti-tank guns. So I don't know how that became, I mean, it's nice to have universal health care at some level, but I don't know how that became such a big part. And they would never vote the NDP into a federal government.
The historians will be able to date when it started to matter. I mean, if you had said to someone in 1950 that Canada had a better developed national health care system than the United States, after they stopped laughing, they'd have tried to find an asylum for you.
Right.
It's kind of guns or butter. Canada used free security provided by the United States to buy a healthcare system that they've sustained ever since.
Well, this is what, you're absolutely right. Didn't I say, when we were talking, I said, what they should say to the United States is, look, you provide security for the rest of the Western world so they can have universal health. in a lot of ways. Britain's a bit of an exception because they actually have an army and so on. But for most people, Canada's always, are they going to line up with China if they become, because it's always sort of like been Britain, then the United States. And of course they fight a lot in wars and they mobilize and they had the third or fourth biggest navy in the world. But then they mothball it and they're able to put things in social programs and so on. But I don't know whether I would be alive if I said that too much in public forum.
You wouldn't want to be saying it in Alberta.
Right. But no, exactly. So what's interesting is, with borders sometimes, is you get freedom of speech when you go to another place to talk about your own country. Would that be a fair enough?
It's a lot easier to study places when you're not in them than it is when you're there, because you're immersed in the assumptions.
Right.
And for example, here's an assumption. The assumption that Canadians make that the United States is particularly ignorant of Canada, which I know now to be a canard. I mean, now that I've lived in the United States for going on 23 years, I can tell you we're equal opportunity ignorant. We're ignorant about just about every country on the globe.
And Canadian...
We don't know much about Mexico. We're not big on La Belle France, except we can tell you they like to surrender, and they invented a kind of potato. I mean, it's a...
Right, liberty fries, right? Or freedom fries, yeah.
Hey, that guy was, that gentleman is a representative from our state, so we want to be careful how we go.
But no, I do agree, but the other thing too is, of course, Canadians probably feel they know more about the United States than they actually do.
How does it go? Americans are benevolently ignorant of Canada, and Canadians are malevolently well informed about the United States.
I think that's a very
It's not mine. It might be McLuhan's.
But I mean, he used to think of Toronto as being at the edge of the world. And that's why he didn't mind being there, because of critical distance. You see, one of the things about relevance, which Fry hated as a word in the 60s, because it reminded him of the Nazis, that things had to be relevant and it had to be applied and so on. But among the hippies and so on, relevant was good, I remember, But part of it is all this kind of applied stuff. One of the great important things about the humanities and so on is we need, and social sciences, is we need critical distance, and we need to be able to talk about human societies. And if you just go to scientific business and other models, and you don't have that, one of the great problems with places like Nazi Germany is that was all wiped out. A lot of people who could make it out made it out to other countries like the United States. And so what happens is that you apply everything, so therefore you don't need critical distance. And one of the things the Academy gives is a kind of, for us to think about things. There are lots of people mired in the assumptions who are people of action and so on. But you need the occasional person to say, hey, have you thought about that assumption? And the other wonderful thing about history is all the dumb and ignorant things we're doing today, if we look back and down our noses at people in the past, people 20 years, 5 years, 100 years from now will be going, these people were either eco-terrorists or we were something else, and we were blind to our own assumptions. So I think it is good to get outside. So I did make that argument. I can tell you that Stéphane Dion there were about 6 of us at the dinner sort of looked like, what's this man talking about? So, because this is to recruit in the federal service, but I think part of that is the assumption about what you do with people who have ties to that country and friends of a country. Just because somebody's not Canadian or not American, and if they actually it's like the Fulbright program in some ways. It makes a certain amount of sense. If people learn about you and they're friends and supporters, then that's a good thing. They don't all have to be citizens or wherever else. So sometimes it's a whole idea of belonging and not belonging. But if you're an expatriate hockey player or Hollywood star or rock star, those categories, it's okay. Then they claim you. You're Joni Mitchell or Neil Young or Rich Little or somebody else, then you're okay. Donald
I
Sutherland.
can assure you that every Canadian in the diaspora can name every other Canadian of note in the diaspora.
Right. And the good news is I hope that changes the attitude in Canada that, you got to stay there or you've somehow betrayed the country, which to me is so ridiculous it makes me want to emigrate.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.